And the gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck, for the customary 30 minutes, and I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to this closed rule and to the underlying legislation. Quite frankly, I had hoped that when we returned from our Easter break that we would be debating and voting on legislation that would help people. I had hoped that maybe we would be able to finally help the hundreds of thousands of dreamers whose lives are now in limbo because of President Trump's decision to end DACA, that we would be able to pass a bill called the DREAM Act to actually provide them some peace of mind. But no, we don't see that on the schedule. I had also hoped that maybe we would do something to address the epidemic of gun violence in this country. Millions of young people all across the country have been protesting in front of congressional offices, have been holding rallies, demanding that Congress debate the issue of gun violence and do something. No, we're not doing that. Instead, what we're doing is another bill to help the financial services industries, and in that effort, we are doing something that I think is going to make consumer protections less relevant. This week, again, the Republican leadership of this House is ignoring the most pressing issues facing our country and our constituents in favor of more legislation to roll back financial protections put into place to prevent another financial crisis. Now, need I remind my friends on the other side of the aisle how damaging the 2008 financial crash was? Millions upon millions of Americans, our constituents, Mr. Speaker, lost their homes. They lost their jobs and their life savings. Many of these families have still not fully recovered from these terrible financial blows. In response, Democrats in Congress came together to pass the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, landmark legislation to address risk in our financial system and ensure our constituents are protected from another damaging financial crisis. Now, Dodd-Frank isn't perfect. Nobody in this Congress says it is. But I strongly object to the calculated campaign by Republicans in this House to continue to chip away at the law, making our financial markets more vulnerable just to benefit their billionaire donors. You know, one of the key provisions of Dodd-Frank is the Volcker Rule. It prohibits banks from engaging in risky trading activities that contributed to the 2008 financial crisis. Simply put, it prevents banks from acting like casinos and gambling with our money. The rule we are considering today provides for the consideration of H.R. 4790, legislation to undermine the Volcker Rule by exempting certain banks from that requirement. The bill also places rulemaking authority solely in the hands of the Federal Reserve, making it easier for the Trump administration to further weaken or eventually repeal this vital consumer protection. Now, that is, of course, the goal of my Republican colleagues in the first place. They have continuously advanced legislation to roll back and weaken the rules put into place to prevent another financial crisis. It is deeply frustrating, and more importantly, it is very dangerous to the financial security of the American economy and American families. Now, Mr. Speaker, this rule also provides for additional debate time on the Republican majority's misguided balanced budget amendment, H.J. Res. 2. Now, normally, when legislation of this magnitude is debated, the leadership of this House brings it through the Rules Committee to set the terms of debate and to allow for alternative proposals to be offered and debated. This will be the 7th time a balanced budget amendment has been voted on in the House, and in the past it has generally been considered under a structured rule granting many hours of general debate, making in order substitute amendments, and providing the minority with the motion to recommit. But as they did in 2011, Republicans will once again bring this legislation to the floor under suspension of the rules, providing no opportunity, none, for members of the majority or the minority to offer substitute amendments. Now, why does this matter, Mr. Speaker? It matters because this legislation, the so-called balanced budget amendment, could do irreparable harm to our economy. It would hinder Congress's ability to respond appropriately to an economic crisis and could potentially even create one. It could even require Congress to cut funding for safety net programs that millions of our constituents rely on. Programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, Supplemental Security Income, and Veterans Pensions. We owe it to our constituents to have a full and open debate on this legislation, to hear from experts, to thoughtfully consider alternatives. But this Republican majority didn't even take the time to hold a hearing or a markup on H.J. Res 2. They're rushing it to the floor under suspension of the rules with no opportunity for us to consider any alternative proposals whatsoever. We're talking about amending the Constitution of the United States. Why in the world would we want to use such a flawed process on such an important issue? Well, Mr. Speaker, because maybe this isn't a serious effort in the first place. My Republican friends know this awful legislation will never become law. So why are we wasting the House's time on this effort? Well, I've got a simple answer. To appease the far-right wing of the Republican Party in an election year, to give the impression that these Republicans are somehow fiscally responsible. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. Republican Representative Charlie Dent of Pennsylvania confirmed in the press this week that really this is merely a messaging vote. If you think this is cynical, consider for a moment the impetus of bringing this legislation to the floor. Press reports indicate that Speaker Ryan agreed to a vote on the balanced budget amendment in exchange for votes to advance the Republican tax scam. Can you believe that? Speaker Ryan, the leader of this House, is advancing legislation that could do irreparable harm to our economy and our safety net just so he could jam through his precious tax giveaway to corporations and wealthy donors last December. Now, let me remind everyone just how terrible the tax scam Republicans rammed through the Congress really is. It raises taxes on 86 million middle-class families to give 83% of the tax cuts included in the bill to the wealthiest 1% of Americans. It gives a $1.3 trillion tax rate break to the largest corporations in this country and rewards these same corporations for shipping jobs overseas. And here's the other part. It explodes the deficit by $2 trillion, jeopardizing the future of Medicare and Medicaid. But this balanced budget amendment is supposed to trick people into believing Republicans still care about fiscal responsibility. It really is disheartening. There's a pattern here, Mr. Speaker. At every turn, House Republicans favor the well-off and the well-connected while ignoring the needs of those in the middle class and working class, and certainly turning their backs on those struggling in poverty. I meet with constituents in my district every day. Quite frankly, they don't ask what we're doing to repeal Dodd-Frank. They certainly don't ask us to ransack Social Security and cut Medicare to give tax breaks to big corporations. They want better jobs and they want better wages. They want us to fix our crumbling infrastructure in their communities and to invest in education. They want us to protect our water and air from pollution. And they made it clear to us last month when over 1 million young people took to the streets across this country that they want action on legislation to protect our communities from the plague of gun violence. But the Republican leadership is ignoring this call and is ignoring any call for progress in favor of legislation to help the wealthy and well-connected donor class. I get it, you need all this money for re-election. But the price that is being paid is a price by the American people, and that is they are getting legislation that is not in their best interest, but is in the best interest of a few wealthy donors. It is reckless and it is wrong. Over 56% of the legislation that we have considered in the Rules Committee this year, that's over half, have been bills to roll back regulations on Wall Street and the financial industry. I don't see millions of people protesting in the street to give Wall Street a bigger break. I don't hear the voices being raised all across this country to say, let's make the rich even richer. Let's do more to give corporations tax breaks. I don't hear that. And yet that's what the focus of this Congress has been about. And by the way, the vast majority of these bills to help the well-connected and the well-off haven't even gone through regular order. This whole process has been a joke. The legislation we are set to consider later this week is no exception. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this restrictive rule, to oppose efforts to weaken the Volcker rule, and to oppose the balanced budget amendment when it is considered later this week, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no witnesses, and I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the hypocrisy of the Republican majority is on full display today. After passing a $1.5 trillion tax scam bill that showers all the benefits on the wealthy and very rich corporations, we are now going to consider an amendment to the Constitution to balance the federal budget on the backs of hardworking Americans by eviscerating social safety net programs. According to the AARP, this balanced budget amendment could subject Social Security and Medicare to deep cuts without regard to the impact on the health and financial security of our most vulnerable citizens. Mr. Speaker, a balanced budget amendment would put the pillars of our social safety net at risk. And if you don't believe me, again, maybe you'll listen to our friends at the AARP. They said this week in a letter, and I quote, "A balanced budget amendment would likely harm Social Security and Medicare, subjecting both programs to potentially deep cuts without regard to the impact on the health and financial security of individuals," end quote. I ask unanimous consent to insert the AARP's letter in the record.
Without objection.
This uncertainty could devastate the nearly half of older American households whose principal incomes come from Social Security, or the over 50 million Americans who depend on Medicare. Even small cuts to Social Security checks or increases to Medicare premiums could impact the finances of older Americans and disabled Americans. Now, the same week that the Congressional Budget Office predicts this Republican majority and their tax scam bill will lead to the return of trillion-dollar deficits, we will consider a balanced budget amendment that has been subject to no hearings and no markups. Even for this record-breaking closed Republican Congress to attempt to amend our Constitution for only the 28th, only 20th time in our nation's history in this manner, quite frankly, is stunning. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask that my colleagues vote no on the previous question, and if we defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to the rule which would amend the bill to exempt Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, vital pillars of our social safety net. And I would just say to my Republican friends on the other side of the aisle, who go home to their constituents and regularly talk about how great Social Security is and how great Medicare is and how important Medicaid is, if you really believe it, you're going to vote to defeat the previous question so we can offer this amendment. I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, to insert the text of my amendment in the record along with extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.